When you picture the medieval era, you probably think of chivalrous knights and fair maidens. But for most women, life wasn't a fairy tale. It was a brutal reality where violence was common and often permitted by the powers that be. This is the story of the silent war the medieval world waged against its women. That romantic image of the Middle Ages, with its towering castles and noble quests, hides a much darker truth. For at least half the population, it wasn't an age of honor and courtly love, but one of systemic oppression and terrifyingly common violence. The social and legal structures of the time created a world where women were devalued, their bodies and lives subject to the whims of men. This wasn't just random cruelty, it was deeply ingrained in the culture. The two great pillars of medieval society, the patriarchal legal system and the doctrines of the Church, created a framework that enabled and rationalized this abuse. Together, they fostered a world where violence against a wife, daughter, or sister was often seen not as a crime, but as a justifiable act of discipline. It was a world where a woman's suffering was framed as penance, and her silence, her duty. Today, we're going to uncover the shocking reality of daily life for these women, exploring not just the physical violence, but the powerful institutions that allowed this abuse to become a terrifyingly accepted part of life. To get why this violence was so widespread, you have to look at a woman's place in the medieval world. From birth, she was legally considered the property of a man, first her father and then her husband. This was cemented through legal concepts like coverture, where a married woman's legal identity was basically absorbed by her husband's. She had few independent rights. She couldn't easily sign contracts, represent herself in court, or control property, which automatically became her husband's. While single women and widows had a bit more freedom, most women lived under the direct authority of a man. This view of women as lesser beings, as property, was the foundation for the right of discipline. Across medieval Europe, it was widely accepted that a husband had the legal right to physically chastise his wife. This wasn't some hidden shame. It was a socially sanctioned practice. Legal and social codes often specified what was deemed reasonable punishment, a chilling phrase that suggests a calculated, acceptable level of violence. So, what did reasonable chastisement look like? It could be anything from a slap to a full-blown beating. While some legal codes suggested a man shouldn't kill or permanently maim his wife, the lines were horrifyingly blurry. A famous French guidebook from 1393, Le Ménagier de Paris, written from the fictional perspective of an old husband instructing his young wife, highlights this. While it doesn't give explicit instructions on beatings, the entire book is built on the idea of absolute wifely obedience, a concept that implicitly sanctioned punishment for any failure to comply. This right to chastise wasn't just a private matter, it was a societal norm. If a woman was seen as disobedient or argumentative, her husband wasn't just allowed to use force, he was often expected to. A man who couldn't control his wife might be shamed for being weak. This created a vicious cycle where a man's honor was tied to his wife's submission, and violence became a primary tool to ensure it. The legal system offered precious little protection. A woman who fled a violent husband was seen as abandoning her duties and would face social stigma and economic ruin. While some ecclesiastical courts might hear cases of extreme cruelty, successfully proving it was nearly impossible, effectively trapping women in cycles of abuse. The violence wasn't an aberration, it was the system working as intended, a brutal mechanism for maintaining patriarchal order. If the law built the cage, the Church provided the moral and spiritual justification for locking it. In an age dominated by faith, the Church's word was absolute, and its teachings on women were tragically tied to ideas of sin, weakness, and suffering. The religious argument for keeping women down started in the Garden of Eden. The story of the fall was interpreted for centuries as proof of female weakness. Eve was cast as the one responsible for humanity's downfall. She was tempted by the serpent and then persuaded Adam to disobey God. This narrative had devastating consequences for all women. Early church fathers expanded on this with terrifying clarity. Tertullian, writing in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, famously addressed all women, stating, "You are the devil's gateway. You are the one who persuaded him, whom the devil was not brave enough to approach. You destroyed so easily God's image, man." This wasn't just about Eve. It was a declaration that her guilt was hereditary, passed down to every daughter. God's curse on her sex, he argued, still weighed upon the world. This idea turned female suffering from a tragedy into a form of divine justice. Pain in childbirth and submission to a husband weren't just social norms, but part of God's ordained punishment for Eve's sin. Saint Augustine of Hippo, one of the most influential thinkers in history, further cemented these ideas. He argued for a natural order where women were to serve their husbands, stating it's natural for men to rule over women. A house where a woman held authority over her husband was, in his view, a house turned the wrong way. These arguments had real-world consequences. They taught society that women were inherently more prone to sin and in constant need of male control. When a husband disciplined his wife, he wasn't just being a brute. He could be seen as a spiritual guardian, correcting the flawed, Eve-like nature of his partner. The pain he inflicted could be rationalized as a necessary corrective, an echo of the suffering that was her birthright. The bruises on a woman's body could be explained not as signs of her husband's cruelty, but of her own sinful nature being brought to heel. Legal theories and religious doctrines are one thing, but what did this actually look like day to day? For many medieval women, violence was a physical, public, and sometimes lethal reality. One of the most terrifying instruments of control was the scold's bridle, or branx. This was a grotesque iron mask locked onto a woman's head, featuring a metal plate, sometimes spiked, that was forced into her mouth to hold down the tongue. Any attempt to speak could cause severe injury. This was the punishment for women deemed scolds, those who argued, gossiped, or spoke out against authority. The punished woman was often paraded through town to be jeered at and humiliated, a punishment designed to utterly destroy her dignity and silence her voice. Equally humiliating were the cucking and ducking stools. The cucking stool was a chair to which a woman was tied and publicly displayed for mockery. The ducking stool was far more dangerous. It was a chair on a lever used to repeatedly plunge a woman into a river or pond, a punishment that could easily lead to shock or drowning. While public punishments were spectacles, the most common violence happened behind closed doors. Domestic abuse was a constant, tolerated feature of married life. With her legal identity all but erased and her social standing dependent on her husband, a woman had almost no way to escape a violent marriage. Even outside the home, a woman's body wasn't her own. While rape was legally condemned as a serious crime, getting a conviction was incredibly difficult. The justice system placed a huge burden of proof on the victim. Courts often required evidence of vigorous physical resistance, torn clothing, bruises, and screams heard by witnesses. Without this, a woman's claim could be dismissed and her own reputation used against her. The crime was often seen less as a violation of the woman herself and more as a property crime against her husband or father. And yet, women did not always stay silent. court records show they courageously brought charges and sought justice. One of the most famous cases is that of Marguerite de Carrouges in 14th century France. In 1386, she accused a squire, Jacques Legris, of brutally raping her. Legris denied it, so her husband, Jean de Carrouges, demanded a trial by combat, a duel to the death where God was believed to grant victory to the righteous. What's often forgotten is the horrifying stake for Marguerite. If her husband lost, it would be taken as a divine sign that she had lied, and she would have been burned at the stake for perjury. Her life was gambled on a sword fight. In the end, her husband won, clearing her name, but her story is a harrowing testament to the risks a woman took just to be heard. The story of violence against women in the medieval era isn't about isolated incidents. It's the story of a system where the law often defined women as property, and the church portrayed them as the inheritors of sin. It was a world built on male authority, where physical force was not just tolerated, but often seen as a necessary tool of discipline. But this isn't just a story of victimization. In the faint script of court records and dramatic trial accounts, we find astonishing stories of courage, the voices of women who resisted, women who spoke out, fled violent homes, and risked everything for justice in a world that offered them little. Their struggle was the beginning of a long, hard journey toward rights and recognition that continues today. Looking back at this dark history isn't about judging the past. It's about understanding the deep roots of misogyny and the structures that for centuries enabled cruelty against women. It reminds us that the rights many of us take for granted weren't just given, they were fought for over generations. The silent war waged on medieval women is a powerful reminder of why that fight was and remains so important. If you found this exploration of history compelling, please consider subscribing and liking this video. It helps our channel continue to uncover these hidden stories. Let us know in the comments what other aspects of medieval life you'd like us to explore next.